Listen and understand. That compiler is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop ever until you are... Nope, hold on, sorry. I'm thinking of the Terminator. Compiled code is fine, just fine, nothing to worry about. Which means this week we talk with Alissa Knight about her recent vulnerability research in hacking law enforcement vehicles, mHealth apps and APIs, and her career going against industry and social norms as both a transgendered and lesbian business leader and hacker. In the news segment, a bug bounty for the end of days, the predators of API security, scaling DevOps and security twins, the unsafety of memory and total recall, and more. Check your defense grid and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Cloud-native development presents new challenges for security teams. Ephemeral workloads are scattered across services, and it's hard to identify resources, monitor configurations, and ensure compliance. Prisma Cloud by Palo Alto Networks is a comprehensive cloud-native security platform, delivering full-stack protection for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. It provides deep visibility, threat detection, and data security, as well as protection for hosts, containers, and serverless while enforcing policy guardrails. Visit securityweekly.com/Prisma Cloud to gain control over your cloud security. Application security is hard when security is separated from your DevOps workflow. Security has traditionally been the final hurdle in the development lifecycle. Iterative development workflows can make security a release bottleneck. With GitLab, security is built into the CI/CD process. Every code commit is automatically scanned for security vulnerabilities in your code and its dependencies. Results are delivered to the developer in their native workflow for rapid remediation. Learn how GitLab enables DevSecOps. Visit securityweekly.com/GitLab for a 30-day free trial.
This is episode 139, recorded February 8th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mr. Shima, how are you? Happy Monday.
Happy Monday, doing quite well. Also doing well because I'm curious if people have a specific guest or topic that they would like us to cover on one of these shows. Submit your suggestions for guests by completing the form at securityweekly.com/guests. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. If you missed Security Weekly Unlocked last month, you can now access all of the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not. Just visit securityweekly.com/unlocked and click the button to register or log right in. Alissa Knight is a recovering hacker of 20 years, beginning her career as a penetration tester, then moving into incident response and forensics. After the charges were dropped when she hacked into a government network at 17, she began working for the U.S. intelligence community at the Cyber Warfare Directorate, supporting human operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2019, she was brought into the Pentagon to assist in securing the global Marine Corps network. In 2020, she published the first book on hacking connected cars and APIs. Recently, she made noise in the healthcare space when she hacked 30 mobile health apps and published that research in January 2021. She now joins Quantic to architect, implement, and maintain a cybersecurity program to manage the bank's IT risk as it continues to disrupt traditional banking. Alissa is a cybersecurity influencer as a YouTuber, content creator, and writer, and she's with us now. Hello, Alissa. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, I actually had to trim down your bio because you've done quite a bit. You have been busy, and it's sort of like, where should we start? We could start at the beginning or start at I was going to say the end. I don't think there's an end for you.
There is
especially no end at all. But before we get into car hacking, financial app hacking, health app hacking, what got you into hacking in the first place? Or maybe what has appealed to you so much that has kept you interested in taking apart cybersecurity things?
Sure. So, I've always believed that what could be made by humans could be broken by humans. I guess it started when I was young and I used to take apart my toys and switch their parts out. I was all about taking things apart. And I think that's really that's really the modus operandi of a hacker, right? Is taking things apart, figuring out how it works, and then sending stimulus that the developer didn't expect to receive. I would say that my hacking career started when I was 13, and when I hacked into let's just call it a restaurant chain. And when I was 17, law enforcement was waiting for me at school and was arrested at school for hacking into a government network. The charges were subsequently dropped, and I went to go work for the U.S. intelligence community in cyber warfare later on, as you mentioned. But I was lucky. My life could have definitely turned a different direction. But I would say that my actual foray into hacking started when I was living in Seattle, and I started a BBS. So, my experience in the industry goes back a long way. So back when things were dial-up modems and VT100 shells. So, rocking out Procom Plus and dialing into BBSs. And I actually ran a large multi-node BBS in Seattle at the time, and really that's where I met people in the underground scene, in the anti-ASCII scene, back when graphics were these colored blocks. And so I would say that it started with BBSs and actually hacked VT100 shells.
That's yes, BBSs and text files, and I'm kind of curious too. It's you're talking about the sort of in internet terms is the ancient history of internet security before there was a proper internet. Even we're talking about baud rates and
oh yeah, upload download ratios.
Yes, exactly. But I'm curious too, because with all of that, you've also, writing a book on connected cars and APIs. How much, when you're looking back at, age 13 and 17, but then looking at cars and connected APIs like you've been hacking recently, what's the same and what hasn't really, what actually has changed perhaps?
That's a good question. I think the amount of resources available to you at the time, when I was growing up in cybersecurity, we didn't have YouTube, right? Like this was early 90s. You just didn't have the resources available to you that you have today. Then there was securityfocus.com, and that's not even a thing anymore. Mm-hmm. You have LinkedIn, and you have these people, you have LinkedIn Learning, now you have cybersecurity degrees. You couldn't even fathom getting a master's degree in cybersecurity back then. And, now, especially even in high school, like I have a son in high school. I'm a lot older than I look, but my 16-year-old son, actually just turned 17, it has Cisco classes at his high school. So you could graduate high school and have all of the requisite knowledge that you need to get your CCNA. But I think I would say that while a lot has changed, the biggest change is the availability of resources to be able to get into cybersecurity, to learn cybersecurity that you didn't have back then. When I started, you went on internet relay chat, right? You went on Pound Hack and Pound ANSI or whatever, and you messed around with egg drop bots, and you met people and hoped that you would meet somebody that could help you fix an exploit. Or, at the time when you were hacking, you had to know how to compile an exploit and get it to work in order to use it. Now it's Metasploit modules, it's point and click. They have graphical user interfaces for exploit kits. It's a lot easier to be a hacker now than it was back then. And, the entire thing has changed. And also, going to the monetary discussion. Back then, it was all about, for notoriety, right? You hacked a network and defaced the website. Rafa was here, World of Hell. And, it was all about defacement gangs and the Aldez defacement mirror. Now it's about profiting from the data that you steal. It's double dipping on that data, right? Lock and leak. You ransomware. You attempt to get money, a ransom payment out of the victim, and then you also leak it, and you're double dipping on your profit. So it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's just continuing to evolve and change.
Absolutely, and it sounded like too there's two particular themes that I kind of heard of what you're describing. One is just the community aspect, that perhaps now it's a little bit easier to find the community of like-minded people that are curious about hacking, want to learn, and just the availability of resources to do so. And also, too, just there's definitely some easier aspects of the tooling with GUIs, with just more open source population of tools out there. But what's interesting, I think, perhaps, is that you mentioned at the very beginning sort of hacking as surprising the developers about, turning software to do something that they didn't expect. In terms of the sort of the vulnerabilities that you've seen, the vulnerabilities that you're going out and either trying to defend from or that you're going out and looking for in networks, has there been a change in the type? And I'm sort of getting to the idea of talking about history, smashing the stack for fun and profit. Are we still dealing with, are you still seeing a lot of those or as the interesting bugs, or do you see different types of bugs in modern software and modern hardware?
Right. So, with the amazing thing about humans is we love to innovate. We as humans continue to evolve, get smarter, do things more intelligently, work smarter, not harder, right? Even the dynamics and the way we work today, it has radically transformed with the pandemic, right? So a lot of organizations now understand that Gen Z, millennials, they all wanted to work a different way on their own hours, not necessarily sitting at a desk, maybe from a beanbag chair when they want, right? Everything changes over time. Nothing in life stays the same. And the same could be said about cybersecurity and connectivity. Now, a lot of people think, oh, well, I'm impervious to being hacked because I'm not driving around in a Tesla, right? But what they don't understand is any card made after 2001 is connected, right? With the introduction of GM OnStar, right? So they all of the modern day cars now talk over GSM, and most importantly, they actually talk to APIs. APIs have really become the underbelly or the plumbing of our financial system, of IoT, everything, including the mobile app economy that we live in now, where everything is an app, talks to APIs. And I think adversaries, I should say, are shifting their focus and shifting their attention to those APIs, knowing that that's where the data is, right? Data is worth more than oil today, right? It's worth more than Bitcoin. But, I think adversaries are quickly shifting their attention in that direction. And so even hacking has changed, right? You mentioned a great text, smashing the stack for fun and profit, buffer overflows, right? But today, everything is really web apps, right? So when you're dealing with the web application, you're not having to worry about writing a buffer overflow, right? You may, for example, maybe SQL injection or some sort of insecure direct object reference, like an IDOR vulnerability or a BOLA vulnerability, broken object level authorization, against APIs. It's a different type of tactic and technique, right, than buffer overflows or heap overflows. So I think with this migration to the cloud, with everything being powered by apps and digital transformation, the way we attack networks as an adversary has certainly changed. Before, 20 years ago, right, it was targeting your Woo FTPD server or targeting your IIS web server. Now it's targeting your API or targeting your Kubernetes, your federated Docker container environment. It's just very different.
It's very different. And the other thing I often point to is that there's so much more as well, just in terms of domains of knowledge to have to focus on. So, for example, we just get into containers and Docker. This is where I like to get silent and let John come in because he's definitely more the expert in that area. And I, of course, love the web and love APIs. But as you rightly point out, with web-based APIs, we're worried much less about buffer and heap overflows and more about meaning much less about what the language it was written in. And I'm curious too, then, kind of thinking about what you've seen within the community, and you are also writing books, doing education on this. What have you seen be? I'm trying to figure out how to phrase my question succinctly, which I never succeed on. What are some of the ways that you've seen people find good resources or learn about these areas? And I guess what I'm really getting at is sort of that aspect of what are the skills that you've seen or suggestions that you would make for ways to draw out whether to go in depth on a particular technical domain or have that breadth of a little bit across many of them, from cloud to heap to stack to SQL injection in the OWASP top 10, for example.
Right. So great question, Mike. One of the things that I do want to bring up, I'm going to point the pink elephant out in the room that I think this question kind of floats around, is, this whole religious debate on whether or not you're an elite hacker or not, if you know how to program. And I've gotten into many threads with trolls and people that are just very divisive. Right. These are very divisive issues that really seek out to try and divide us as a community. And that's making the claim that you can't call yourself a penetration tester or a hacker unless you know how to code. And I hate that argument. I think adversaries want us to be divisive. I think adversaries want to, how do you defeat your enemy? You divide your enemy and turn your enemy against each other, right? Common Sun Tzu art of war tactics, right? So I think it's horrible that we do that because there's already so many disenfranchised people in the cybersecurity community, whether you're a woman in cybersecurity, part of the LGBT community in cybersecurity, and I wish that we would stop this rhetoric around, having to be a programmer. Because if you look at the targets today in attacking an organization, you're looking at APIs, you're looking at their AWS cloud workloads or their Azure cloud workloads. You don't have to know how to download and review that source code, look for buffer overflows. You don't have to worry about doing that today because of our infrastructure, because of how much the infrastructure has transformed, right? So a lot of times it's black box pen testing where you just don't have anything but a port number and stimulus and response. Right. And so I want to address that aspect, but also as far as your question is concerned for, where people can learn and what they should learn, the thing about it is that, and what I think is really exciting is for the ADD poster childs out there like myself, it never stays stagnant. Right. It's always changing. It's always moving. The exploit from Teso, if you guys remember you guys and girls remember the Teso crew, those exploits aren't really applicable anymore, right? So a lot of them don't work, but we're still using that tool like from Rainforest Puppy, Nictu, and as everything has moved to the web apps. And so, the full-blown software installations and fat clients that gave way to things like, buffer overflows and heap overflows have now been replaced by SQL injection and BOLA vulnerabilities.
No,
so the learning should be in that direction. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, no, I was saying, yes, we've definitely taken the historical anthropology of, hacking crews and tools with RFP and TISO and woo-woo. But I think to your point, too, is that there are multiple paths into the industry, especially now, especially for as much as I might like to be able to pretend I could drop a couple other FRAC article numbers or names that maybe are historical interest, but possibly aren't necessarily relevant to attacking modern networks when we're talking about just what cloud environments look like, what different types of security architectures look like. ASLR, just so you know, that is old on its own, but that wasn't late 90s hacking. At least I hope not. As I say that, I have to go check. But multiple paths into the industry, as well as multiple disciplines, multiple ways to areas to focus on to become expertise, because there is such a complexity of networks that we're both trying to break or build, depending on what avenue you're taking on security. I'm curious too. Let's talk about, speaking of breaking a bit, maybe some more recent things. January 2021, which I'll eventually get off. You were looking at some healthcare apps, mobile apps. What were some of the things that you found there? What does your modern research look like, and the things that you've been finding recently?
So in 2001, I spoke at Black Hat briefings, and in 2000, I actually published, if you're old enough to remember BugTrack, and John, if you guys can remember BugTrack, I published the first vulnerability on hacking VPNs, and back then it was God's gift to security, triple DES encryption, right? And I used to love it when vendors would say this is unhackable. Right. So, things have obviously changed a lot from then until now, but not much in the areas of how I approach vulnerability research. And, I think a common misperception is that hackers sort of come out of the womb knowing how to do something like, Alissa, you must have always known how to hack connected cars, or Alissa, you must have known how to always hack mobile apps. And that just simply is not the case. And I find that my vulnerability research is actually my classroom. That may sound crazy, right? And let me say that again. My vulnerability research is my classroom. And it's because I learned so much about teaching something, because I believe that you haven't fully mastered something unless you can teach it, right? So, in my vulnerability research around mobile health apps, and even, gosh, if you rewind back to last year, my financial services and fintech mobile apps, which I don't think I addressed with your team, was, I downloaded 30 financial services mobile apps and hacked them in less than a week, reverse engineered them, and also found hard-coded API keys and tokens in them. Now, what was different about last year's research with financial services was obviously the banks were not gonna partner with me and say, hey, hack our APIs. This year was different. What's very different about this research this year is the mHealth companies, and we're talking about companies with billion-dollar market caps that were partnering with me to say, hey, Alissa, break our stuff, hack it. We're all for this. We're drinking the Kool-Aid. Come hack our stuff. And it was great, because not only did I take it from the research of, reverse engineering the mobile apps and finding those hard-coded keys, tokens, and credentials, but I could actually then take it further and actually go after the APIs. And what was interesting there was, really how the degree of security and the degree of hardening actually went down as I started to target the APIs. And, it's really, to me, I felt like just coming out of this now in 2 years in a row in targeting APIs, that we just aren't getting it. We meaning developers, we and as defenders aren't getting it, that, we're putting this stuff out there, and it's such a critical fabric to our infrastructure that we don't, the level of hardening isn't commensurate with how much we rely on it in our day-to-day lives, right? So this is mobile health. We're uploading our X-rays, our clinical reports, we're talking with our clinicians, our mental health professionals. All of these things are floating over mHealth. There's over 300,000 mobile health apps in the app stores. And this amazing company called Approve came to me and wanted to sponsor the research, said, hey, Alissa, we want you to blow this stuff up. I said, great, sure, let's do it. And I wasn't prepared for the level of vulnerability, meaning that I was accessing other patients' clinical reports. I was accessing people's allergies, right? So, Mike, if I wanted to come after you and kill you, I would just need to find out, hey, are you using a mobile health app? And the interesting thing is that I don't know if you guys have seen some of those emails from when you go to the doctor. It'll say, hey, your results or your lab results are available on the site you register. Your results, your lab reports, all of these things are going to these third parties for you to access electronically. whether you give that permission or not. Right. So, it would be really easy for me to come after you and make it look like an accident by finding out what you're allergic to. And, maybe you're allergic to strawberries, there's my technique. Right. But, it was scary. And, it's one thing to go after financial services API. It's another thing to go after an mHealth API and actually use bull vulnerabilities to access other patient records. And for our audience who isn't aware of what a bull vulnerability is, Mike, if you'll allow me to digress for a moment, I'll quickly explain what that is. It's like if Mike, you and I were to go to a cocktail party, and you went into the coat check and you gave your wallet and your coat to the coat place, and you're wearing a Prada coat, right, or a Burberry coat. I'm like, oh, I want that coat, and you got the number 18, and then I came in behind you and they gave me number 17. Right. I checked in my stuff and I took 17. And then I took that ticket and I changed that 7 to an 8. And I went back to the coat check and said, hey, here's my number. And they give me back your Burberry coat and your wallet. That's a great example of a bull vulnerability. It's yes, I'm authenticated. I'm allowed to be here. I should be here. I've presented the credentials of the ticket, but I'm not authorized to take home Mike's coat and wallet. So, it's basically the most systemic vulnerability I find in APIs. This is the most common vulnerability. It doesn't matter what API I look at, whether it's a connected car API or if it's an mHealth API, I'm finding bull vulnerabilities all over the place. And for those of you who may know about it, it was previously called IDOR, or insecure direct object reference vulnerabilities. They're now being called BOLA, and it's actually number one on the API, on the OWASP API top 10. It's a critical bug, and I'm finding it everywhere.
No, that's insane. For the record, I'm Team Versace, thanks to Nomi Malone. And no, that's a great way to explain things. I like that, because, and the other aspect of that too is, talking to these BOLA vulnerabilities, it's not something that I think is as easy to automatically scan for, whether we're talking about code, static or dynamic. And the reason I say that is context is important, because you made a really good point when you're setting up that metaphor, in the sense that I'm supposed to be here, but I'm not supposed to be accessing this particular code. I was supposed to be getting 17, not 18. Correct. And I think that's one of those interesting challenges, is that for as much as I absolutely will love linting, SAST and DAST for many reasons, there's still this human ingenuity that's necessary both to find these vulnerabilities, but to figure out how can we harden these apps against it. And I'm curious too, when you're looking at these vulnerabilities and working with developers explaining them, it sounds like you've got some good metaphors, some good to set up and explain.
I'm full of great metaphors.
but I'm curious too.
Great stories.
Absolutely. How successful have you been, or how have those conversations gone with developers in the sense of hardening? And what I'm kind of getting at there is the difference between talking about improving an architecture versus just fixing this bug and then the next bug. Oh, and then by the way, there was this other bug, and they're all sort of the same thing, that whack-a-mole approach.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought this up, Mike. Here's the thing. After 20 years, you just start to see bugs. Sorry. Over the last 20 years, you just sort of see bugs sort of rear their ugly face again over and over and over again, right? They just keep coming back, right? Hard coding credentials, like that's a stupid problem to have, right? Hard coding credentials for S3 buckets, that sort of thing. But it's still happening, and I'm a big believer in shift left security. I really, this whole thing about securing things once it's in production, or securing a product after it's made, it's just not something that should be happening, but it is. I really believe we need to get organizations to stop just investing in employee-wide information security awareness training, and also invest in sending your developers to secure code training. And that's a narrative that's very common across a lot of organizations that I've spoken to. In 2019, I think it was the the most I'd ever been on the road. I was a nomad. I spoke at conferences in Asia, in Europe, talking about this research. And, one of the common themes was, we don't get secure code training as developers. We take that annual spearfishing thing, an information security awareness training that the receptionists get, but we as developers don't get secure code training. And so I think there's that problem. I think the fact that I'm a big believer in security should be like layers of an onion. Figure out what it is you're trying to protect and build your security like layers of an onion around that instead of trying to protect everything. We need to move to the zero trust mentality where we don't trust our employees just because they work for us. We don't trust their infrastructure because those employees are now working from home that their son, little Tommy, or their daughter, little Jane, is gaming on, right? And so we can't trust the infrastructure. We certainly can't trust their endpoints. We just can't trust any of it. So I think we need to move to the zero trust mentality where we're training our developers. We are securing the infrastructure. We're also isolating endpoints into enclaves and getting away from this ridiculous notion of flat networks. I look at on my YouTube channel, I've got this video of me, dancing around with cameras and, because I hacked a bank through the CCTV cameras in the parking lot, and because those cameras were on the same flat network as banking systems. So, we're still doing this in 2021, and we just need to evolve and we need to change. So, I think there's definitely multiple answers to that question. I think it is a problem. I think dynamic and static code analysis are definitely something that, as you mentioned, we need to be doing. We need to be hacking our own solutions and hacking our own networks and applications. And we also need to trust but verify. Right? Just because our developers are saying something is secure, or just because our internal cybersecurity teams are saying something secure, we need to trust but verify. Remember, your employees are drunk on their own Kool-Aid, right? You need to go beyond that and look to other resources.
I'm curious too. We've talked about, you mentioned BOLA, and we're talking about that. And you mentioned just now that secure code training, educating developers on things to worry about, or understanding, what can go wrong with their applications. When you approach them and have those conversations about education, are there one or two other topics that you really like to highlight for them that you see the light bulb go off, or really just want to convey a particular principle in this type of education with them?
Right. And I think that for me, the answer to that is authenticate and authorize. And I think we have a tendency, at least from the applications that I've looked at, to forget that just because someone is authenticated, it doesn't mean they're authorized to see it, right? Take the principle from the Department of Defense, where just because you have a clearance, right? Just because you have top secret clearance, it still doesn't mean you get to see everything that's classified as top secret, right? There are some things that are a need to know. Just because you're authenticated, just because you're allowed to log in, it doesn't mean you should be authorized to be able to see everything. Just like the same way we approach group-based security, role-based access control. And that just isn't there in a lot of the applications I look at. Just because you have a JOT token, right? A lot of the problems that I've seen is that they're not looking at the payload of the JOT token to make sure that the user ID in the JOT token matches up with the resource you're requesting or the object you're requesting. So it's a systemic problem. And I think that the answer to that is developers need to start understanding the distinction, the idiosyncratic distinctions between authentication and authorization.
So speaking of need to know, you've written a book about car hacking, connected cars and APIs. You're also writing a screenplay. Is that true?
Yeah. So I'm, my whole life, my whole, the theme to my life has been live every day like it's your last, right? And I want to do everything. I want to experience everything. And for me, last year, several producers approached me And with Mr. Robot ending and the protagonist in that show being male, really, if you look at Hollywood today, it's very much about, strong women who are influencing the younger generation of girls that they can be anything and do anything. Even cybersecurity, even being a hacker, that your gender or gender identity doesn't preclude you from what you can and can't accomplish. And I think that really resonated with the producers and really wanted to do a new show where the protagonist was female. And you look at Wonder Woman, a lot of the movies coming out of Hollywood, you're seeing an increase in the number of shows and movies where the protagonist is a woman. And so they approached me about wanting to do this new series where the protagonist is female, and wanted to do it based on my life. So, being arrested at school for hacking into a government network, moving into the U.S. intelligence community, trading in a keyboard for an M4 and AR-15, and being one of the first women that went through private SEER training, taking tactical hostage rescue operations training, and going from a hacker to that to, being a serial entrepreneur and starting and selling multiple companies in cybersecurity. And where I am now, I guess it made for a good Hollywood story. So I'm in the process of writing a screenplay. And like most things I approach, I have no idea what I'm doing, have no clue. Just downloaded Scrivener and thought, how hard could this be to write a screenplay? And I didn't realize that, I was thinking, well, doing a screenplay for a TV series is a lot easier than doing a screenplay for a movie. And it didn't dawn on me that you're actually writing for a full series, TV series, you're actually writing the screenplay for 5 full-length movies. So it ended up being this, so they want to do this story on this sort of dystopian future where it's loosely based on my life, but also folds in some fiction for those interested.
No, that's awesome. Speaking is our theme of metaphors for the day. I'm sure it's just as easy to write a screenplay as it is to write secure software. So maybe there's some things
Exactly.
to discover along the way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just figuring it out as I go. Unfortunately, there's nothing in my IDE interface to warn me that I'm writing a bad screenplay. So, I mean, it's like, in this age of everyone wanting to binge watch things, I know that the most important episode's going to have to be the pilot episode. So, and I keep rewriting it. So I need to stop doing that and making, perfect the enemy of the good.
No, that's fantastic. And so anything else that we should be looking for on the research? So you've been doing fintech apps, what, in 2019? 2020 was your mHealth apps. 2021, any hints on what type of apps you're going to be looking at this year? Is something we could be looking forward to?
Yeah, I'll drop it on your show. I actually have just been contacted to hack a train. So, with this new, with everything being connected and, it not just being cars, there's other, critical infrastructure that is connected, and that's trains. So, it feels like I'm following that script with John Candy on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. But this time it's trains and also super yacht. And so there's actually boats out on the water that are connected to the internet as well, floating IP addresses. So this year is a train, and those interested, there's a trailer on my YouTube channel that talks more about that research.
Excellent. Well, with trains and super yachts, we're looking forward to you taking down some super villains. So want to thank you for joining us, Alissa.
Thank you, Mike. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on the show.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to all our listeners. Thank you to John as well. As always, we're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.
Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/capsulate today to request a demo.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list and join our Discord server. And if you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And now we come to the news. And John, a lot of the news this week is talking about some programming languages. And this felt dangerous to say while we were still talking with Alissa. But if I do have an allergy, I'm allergic to Perl code. So that's the one thing we need to worry about. But there's a couple different things that I think are sort of a theme to build around. And I'm going to start just talking one article about the bug bounty program of last resort. This was two researchers sort of proposing the idea of what if we just put together a whole lot of money and just had a bug bounty program for all of the vulns that aren't being sponsored by corporations or don't have deep pockets because they're open source code, things like that. And rather than get into the details of sort of what they were presenting or the numbers that they were using, for example, they're saying, potentially there's sinking $1.7 billion into this to cover a lot of what the vulnerabilities were throughout 2020. I'm kind of curious, should we be investing in just finding more of the vulns, or what if we actually invested on the securing the hardware side or having more hands on keyboard, so to speak, writing that code? And I'm not sure if that kind of resonates with you or what your thoughts on this might be.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I mean, so from a few different angles in here, the idea initially of having the last resort concept, that's sort of cool. And then as you were just talking, I started realizing, I mean, we've had that for 20 years, and it's called CERT, at least in the US. But now it's just you're putting money, not just being that last resort. So I don't know. That's interesting. I think I sort of agree with what you're hinting at there, the concept of at some point you can't just keep throwing money at that's I don't think that's going to be a complete solution, just always sort of dangling the carrot of money. It'll work to get researchers not selling their stuff, hopefully in the black market. I think that's one of the reasons you do that, is to have some sort of a more public bug bounty, so we can fix the issues. Right. I can't talk. Common problem, but I think I'm with you. I'd love to see a little more on the other side of that coin. And it's funny, Alissa mentioned something there that caught my ears. You guys are having a great conversation, so I wasn't interrupting. We've had, I think, the last 2 or 3 weeks now, we've had guests saying that we need to be investing more on the training side. And while, thinking about my last org or two, haven't been doing actual trainings to developers like that, security training. I was teaching security training classes, a decade ago. So I know it's there. I know it's popular, or I know it's existed. I know it's becoming more popular. But that's sort of, it seems like that's one of those trends that's sort of sticking its head up the last month or so. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if that continues this year. The need, or the advertised need.
No, that's interesting. And there was, I didn't want to make this episode all of the Google Project Zero articles, of the week, but there was another security on Google's security blog that I didn't post, so I'll have to post it after this. They're talking about their no prevent fix framework for about open source security, and they basically wanted to say, Google's saying we want to put some more essentially burden on open source projects in the idea that we should know who's committing consequential code. We should have code reviews for critical code paths. And they're basically saying the idea that open source projects, because they are critical, and they have lots of supply chain implications, we should have some commensurate security around them. I think it was kind of interesting, and I'm trying to tie it to what you were saying, both in the sense of just what secure coding is, there's a training, but also that idea of investment. It's one thing for us to say in this case, talk about what's a bug bounty of last resort, spending money there, or there's another article just about Google was spending $6.7 million on bug bounties just for their own software, Android, Chrome, some of their other properties. But John, you've made the point a couple times, I think it was the end of last year, maybe we started off this year, about Microsoft's security budget and where that is being spent. So I think that where I'm kind of going at with this is that it's interesting that we have, on the one hand, a call to say, let's put more into bug bounty just so we can pay for all of the vulns that come out, and hopefully we get those vulns off of the gray market, so to speak. And here's another call from Google to say we need more maturity within open source development. But there's not a money investment in that. It's not saying necessarily that we're going to actually assign more developers. We're going to put more money into, rather than fixing yet another bug, re-architecting the code to make that better. And I'm going with that is sort of that difference between OpenSSL and boring SSL, for example. Or we have something like ImageMagick, or a lot of these, pick any image parser, video parser, or PDF parser for that matter. Why don't we rewrite them into something like Rust or like that is a bit more memory safe to avoid a lot of the vulnerabilities that we've seen historically?
Yeah, you really just said a bunch of interesting things at once, which is really not like you. No, I'm kidding. So first, let's go back to let's see if I can remember that on the open source thing. I'm actually going to make a note about that one. So on the previous topic there, still the same topic, the first half of it. In a way, what we're talking about on this bug bounty of last resort, that could almost be seen as a government program, which would have, whether it's actually government run or not, a governing body would be running something like that. How does it get funded? It's going to have to collect something like taxes. So, and maybe that's a consortium, maybe it's just the biggest players. It'd be really interesting to see what's Google's security budget. I haven't seen that number. I might have to go digging around because that's got to be up there too, right? And then the last thought I had there, sort of bringing those two together, is again sort of around governance. Linux Foundation is I think it's LX. I think it's lfx.dev. Is they're working on sort of a collection of tools for open source projects, and they're doing some stuff in their security. And I think we're hopefully going to have one of their folks on in a few weeks to sort of talk a little more depth about that. But Apache, Linux Foundation, all these large CNCF, all these large orgs that it's sort of resembling what you have at a company, right, where you have the security group, because it is hard to get these folks in every single team or get everyone tested. So that could be a positive reason to, if you're on the open source side, to get your project into one of these larger groups. And then really back to your question, not that I'm not trying to blow it off. Generally, I tend to not be a fan of when I see a new project that's written in a different language. So we saw this when Python came out back, about 15 years ago. All the Perl scripts were being rewritten in Python, especially startups and stuff like that. And I think, usually I'm not a big fan of that. But when we're actually switching to a language that's going to make something more secure like Rust, that gives me, or actually, like what Microsoft is doing, where they're taking the sensitive parts of their applications, or I should say the more potentially vulnerable, and they're switching those over to Rust. So I think I'm a big fan of that. If you're doing it with reason beyond just you're bored this weekend.
Yes, doing it within reason. And I think even because last week we even talked about the iMessage and blast doors, and that wasn't a language rewrite, that was an architecture rewrite. And I think that's where I tend to be much more a fan of and care less about choice of language and more about what's being used. And further talk about this point, there was another pair of articles I posted from the Enigma conference. One was talking about memory unsafety issues, and the other was from Maddie Stone and Project Zero, talking about just what they have seen over the past year of 0 days. On the memory unsafety side, we'll start with that first. The presentation made a good point at the beginning, talking about, again, try not to make this the Google show this week, but some research that Google was showing that security keys were pretty much 100% successful against preventing account takeover attacks. So there were SMS codes still pretty good, TOTP codes still pretty good, but drop in a hardware token like a YubiKey, for example, pretty much you don't have to worry about ATOs. And so the idea there, point to be made, is that we've gotten rid of a class of vulnerabilities. What the rest of this presentation was saying is that there's this other class of vulnerabilities called memory unsafety, buffer, heap, etc. And they're all in, pretty much C and C++ code. Now, some of my reaction to this is partially we just have a massive population of applications out there that just so happen to be written in C and C++ code. So that's kind of where the vulns are. Alissa was telling us about BOLA vulnerabilities. There's plenty of web application vulnerabilities that are very consequential for our personal data, financial data, health data, etc. That have nothing to do with these. But if we're talking on the idea of Chrome, Firesoft, there are a lot of these. So that's sort of where it ties into the language. And if you to look through these slides, Chad, or if you had a different reaction to that. Because if not,
no. Yeah, no. I only glanced at them first. I want to go back and read these a little closer.
Yeah.
But going back to. I mean, I get the point of I was sort of focusing on the first one, the memory on safety. The point of that is interesting, and again, Alissa was talking about buffer overflows decreasing. I think they're on the website. I don't think they are in general. I just did a search on my mailbox and just looking at all the different advisories out there coming in. We're still seeing a pretty good chunk of buffer overflows, and I think in one of our next stories we're actually going to be talking about a few of them. So as much as we want it to go away, and as much of the C tooling and all the different make tooling and our linters are helping with that, I think there's still that issue out there that needs to be addressed, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this is where I thought I just kind of wanted, despite me talking quite a bit about the memory on safety presentation, I wanted to just hit that briefly and highlight the other presentation from Enigma about the state of 0 day and the wild exploitation. And I think that kind of ties to the bug bounty of last resort, investments, because here was Maddie Stone, a researcher at Project Zero, talking about the importance of variant analysis and pointing out that one of the quotes from it, 1 out of every 4 detected 0 day exploits could potentially have been avoided if a more thorough investigation and patching effort were explored. And I thought that was a really great point, because it's the idea that, sure, we may have a lot of, call them memory and safety vulnerabilities, but if we're just playing that whack-a-mole to fix them one at a time, or as is common, and we've seen this in a couple articles we've even covered here with some of like Microsoft Kerberos and a couple others, sometimes the patches don't actually fix the underlying problem, or the patches then have to have patches for the patches because the vulnerability is still exploitable with a little bit of a variant. And this is one of the points she's making. And this is why, to me, this is what highlighted my reaction to that first bug bounty article, the idea that I don't know that I would invest necessarily just in finding more of the vulns, as well as investing someone to be tasked with how pervasive is this? Or was this one-line fix the best fix we could have done, or something else? Yeah. And that's where, too, I'm not even getting to that idea as I keep interrupting you. I hear you trying to get in. It doesn't even feel to me like we need to rewrite it in a different language. Perhaps we just need to be better about the languages we're writing in from a security architecture point of view.
Yeah, and you're not cutting me off. I was just saying, yeah. But I'm fully with you on that. And the phrase I've used in a few talks that I'm pretty fond of is really when you go after these things, to deal with intention. And by that, I mean, you're not just, when the bug comes through saying there's a buffer overflow in line 50 and whatever. Again, one of my things I always say in here is we're all pressed for time, but this is one of those, right? We know you're pressed. You got to get that bug resolved and move on. But man, if the vast majority of us don't have Google scale code bases or Microsoft scale or Oracle scale or whatever, right? We're looking. Our code bases are probably within hundreds of thousands, I'd say tens to hundreds, if not maybe low millions lines for most of us, the projects we're working on. It doesn't take that much time to either do a grep or a find or what have you, just to go through the code and go, am I seeing that pattern somewhere else? And I think this is something, as I think about it, GitHub, one of their acquisitions last year with, was it SemGrep? Yeah, SemGrep, right? Where they've actually added a tool in to help you. I think, or actually, that might be a separate company. So sorry, that's where Clint is, right? But that ability to have a tool that just go and grep for these patterns. You know what's there. You know what's causing the problem. Once you see it one place in your code, the chance of it just being in that one place is, again, last hour, as we said, we're humans and we'll repeat things all the time. So if I write a piece of code, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to write something, even if I rewrite, not copy and paste, it's going to be pretty similar. So if I write it in a few different functions or a few different bits, I'm probably going to make that same mistake. So, okay, let's actually fix it with intention and go through and actually find those things. And I wish we did a bit more of that. I know it, like I said, time, but I agree with you. I think that'd be a little bit better spend of some of this money than just whack-a-mole on the other side.
Yeah. So switching to, there's another article here from Salt. And they were talking sort of another state of security, this time API security. And I think this was a nice, different perspective than memory and safety issues, as they're looking at APIs, something we were just talking about with Alissa. And one of the things that stood out for me in particular about this was they throw a bunch of percentages out there, a bunch of statistics. But one was that of what they saw, 96% of API exploits happen against authenticated APIs. And to me, that's pretty interesting. One, for the aspect of, especially if you have a dynamic scanner, you need to have a scanner that can handle such things, authentication. But it was also just pretty interesting is that where am I going with this? As you're doing testing, security testing, building the testing, are you able to exercise those particular workflows to be able to find those types of authentication or authorization types of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, and again, talking about, it's funny, I've been interviewing a few folks recently, interviewing for a hiring, not just interviewing for a podcast. And one of the areas we keep digging into, we have a homework problem we like to give people, and it's basically, write something fairly simple, not too difficult, and then give us a demo of it. And it's interesting to see always how people approach the authentication part of this. It uses a third-party service, so you have to use OAuth. But then how are they taking that OAuth token? Are they just throwing it into the URL? Are they actually doing a JWT? Are they watching for DOS attacks if they're not validating where that token's coming from? So there's a bunch of sort of common patterns here that, it's not the goal of the assignment, but I'll ask a question or two when I see something like, did you think about this, or could you think about how to improve it? And my interview style is, for the vast majority of you lucky enough not to be interviewed by me, I tend to be fairly laissez-faire, and I just give people, I throw a question out there and just I want to see how they answer. Are they thinking about it? How would they approach it? Because a lot of these things we don't know the answers, right? I asked someone just this morning if she had more time and her boss had just given her the question I gave her, how would she go about researching it? And she said Google. I'm like, okay, that's great. But I'm like, well, is there a place you usually go after that? Like, what is there like a favorite for this language, whatever else? And like her first response was Medium. It's like, okay, cool. That tells me that she's actually done this and she knows how to do it and she knows where to go find things, which I think is more important for a lot of this stuff, right? And again, but it's hard. You have to be open-minded and understand that you're not perfect to be able to say, maybe this isn't the best way to write this. And this is where code reviews come in handy in your company, because someone else might see, okay, you did the authentication, but did you actually validate that now that you've got a valid user, is that user the owner of that object that you're about to return back or delete or whatever else? So Yeah, there's a lot to do there, right? So it again, this is probably a little bit like an open SSL type problem, wherein that you have to have not just that surface level, but actually be a little more in depth and know what you're doing to do it right. That analogy was a little vague at the end, but I hope that makes sense.
No, I think it does make sense. It also sets up a great segue to talk about one of the other articles from Capsulate this time, establishing a scalable collaboration between security and DevOps. And the reason I thought that was a good thing to tie to what you were just saying is that one of the things this article was highlighting was some research from 451 Group, I think it was that it has an interesting list of skill sets, and the phrase that was posed, or the question that was posed, was how adequately represented are these skill sets? And one of those items was security architecture. And for me, I would love to see that improve. And I think that kind of speaks to just what you were saying just now, is like, how are you, a developer, thinking of a particular problem, thinking of testing it, thinking of approaching it, thinking of just even learning more about it, to make it a more secure, to make it more secure. So that stood out for me. And the other part of it was interesting, is that penetration testing was on there, but that also comes around to the idea of, where do we invest? Do we really need to have penetration testing invested as part of our internal team's skill set, or would that be something great to just invest in from a vendor externally? So it's kind of just some interesting things there about where people are thinking of for what their security-minded DevOps teams might look like.
Yeah, where do I start? So a pen tester, I'll say pen testers. Let's go try and more generalize it, but I think of pen testers as, unless you're a really large org that has blue teams and red teams, and you can actually support that and support getting those really hard to find people, it's just like visual designers, I think, graphic designers, either UI or print, in that I think they should be in a separate third-party agency that you contract to. And what you get out of that is that agency. I mean, it's consulting, you have to engage a consultant correctly, but presuming you're doing that part, the consultancy, it's their job to go and find those folks and keep them entertained. And we got an article in here about NCC, talk about a perfect analogy. But also, hopefully they will rotate those people through. So as you have different engagements with them, you're going to have different people doing different pen tests. So, Joe maybe is really fond of SQLi and finds those all the time. Maybe Sarah is really great at finding cross-site scripting issues. So as you get different people testing that, and it's really hard to get that combination side of a company. But in general, I went hard right on the pen test thing here. But in general, I think pen test is sort of lower on that list of things in this report. This is interesting. After we had, I think it was Radware a month or so ago, was talking about hiring security expertise was number 3 on their list after buying their product. Funny that. But so, yeah, IoT, security, DevOps, security architecture. I'm with you on security architecture. It's tough to do, man. It's actually getting a company to slow down and say, hey, we need to bring security arc in here. You got to have a pretty good grip on the horns of that bull. Cloud platform expertise. We've seen this for the last probably 5 years now. So that's continuing to go. I think people are realizing, probably after last year, people are really going to start going to that cloud. So, yeah, interesting paper though.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, and just from where people are thinking of. And I don't have. We have an article from NCC Group. I'd possibly save that for last. I did want to touch on one more article from or presentation from Enigma, and this I think ties a little bit maybe to, not so much maybe to architecture. So it's going to be a reach there, but it hits my buttons in the sense of the visualization and communication of security. And in this case, is talking about basically nutrition labels. So this is our metaphor of the day, or metaphor episode. But nutrition labels for privacy and security. And what I thought was pretty interesting is that, one, that's a big challenge. How do you convey that in a concise manner? And two, what do you emphasize? Like, what's important, and how do you just explain that to a wide range of an audience that maybe is not an expert to, old, late, early 90s frac articles and don't really care about IoT other than it's 3 letters and it makes my camera turn on or it makes my music play. And so looking at the slides, and I think the slides weren't numbered, but looking at one of the labels, it's interesting how they break down into they talk about purpose, or they talk about data just stored on device, what data is stored in the cloud, who's the data shared with, who's the data sold to. And I thought that was kind of an interesting approach to just explaining what's in the box of these devices from both the security and a bit more from the privacy angle as well.
Yeah, I'm actively very interested in this topic. It's funny, I didn't get a chance to see the slides till this weekend. One of my hats right now, so CNCF has one of their special interest groups is SIGApp delivery operations. They're working on SIGApp app delivery. They're working on an operator white paper for what's CNCF's status on operators and best practices and stuff like that. I'm helping with chapter 4, which is the operator security. And a plug, we're always looking for more people in that working group, so reach out to me if you want to come and chat with us weekly about what operator security should look like. But one of the things I was talking about last week, just coincidentally, is it'd be really great if we had some sort of standard or something for literally this exact same thing on the security side, especially for open source projects, right, where you're like, I'm getting this thing, I'm running it in my cloud, I'm running it in my Kubernetes cluster with a bunch of privileges. What is it? Do I have time to review it? Is it from a good source? What is it doing with my cluster? So the privacy aspect of this is interesting. That's I think there's folks already working on that, I think. Well, obviously, yeah, the Apple and stuff like that. But the security side, I haven't heard of folks outside of this paper yet talk about this. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in this. I think this is especially, we've talked about API today, we've talked about cloud, all these type of things. As you have all these moving parts, you really need something like this, I think, to make our lives a little easier.
No, and speaking of possibly the opposite of making our lives easier is the research summary of 2021 from NCC Group. And the reason I say that is there's a lot to read there. I think it's a great resource covering everything from cryptography, open source tooling, hardware embedded systems, to cloud and containers, to data science, public interest, and reducing vulnerabilities at scale. So sort of like, pick any or all of those dimensions, and there's quite a bit of interesting reading there. For me, I glommed on to mostly the crypto section. I'll admit, partially because it was first and I was being lazy, but also because those are interesting vulnerabilities that we see, and these are vulnerabilities in implementation or vulnerabilities in design, and these are pretty independent of whatever programming language you've used. And so that to me is why these kind of are always of interest. And so, John, I'm not sure what stood out to you on this massive list, or what's the area that you think you might dive into?
This thing is a fire hose of stuff to cover. I mean, we could do probably 2 or 3 podcasts on this thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like you, I've started reading, and the first section was cryptography, and my thoughts on that. So I scrolled back up to the top and realized I had a table of contents. So I've been sort of skipping around this doc, and so I've looked over the cloud stuff. I've looked at the open source tools, which there's some interesting ones in there. It's fun to see some of these. I think historically we've always had point tools, and then, like we talked about, the bigger things like the Metasploits come along, that the frameworks. It's interesting. It seems like the last year or so, and maybe it's just on the Kubernetes side or the cloud side, I'm starting to see individual tools come back. So they're not so much exploits, but they're independently developed. They start off as something a little simple, probably a weekend project, and they're sort of going into something a little bigger. So I think that's pretty cool. Anybody who wants to, literally it'd be fun to see how big this is if you print this out. It's got to be 100 pages. But there's a ton of good stuff in it.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be fair to assign any of our listeners to read through that, because it was 96 papers, 47 presentations. But pick something out, and as John said, let us know what was interesting, because we could easily have a couple of shows just on several of those topics. So with that, hopefully my connection isn't struggling too much. So John, maybe we'll make you talk a little bit more. You mentioned the special interest group. Anything else that you wanted to draw attention to this week? We have, I think, next Monday off, so we have a 2-week gap. What should people go read about or dive into?
Yeah, like I said, I've been getting a little more active in CNCF. We're about to start coming into security season, right? I guess another month or so before we start hitting the RSA and that type of thing. I think really, if I was going to point someone to something for next week or so, just keep yourself busy with this NCC paper. There's lots of stuff that we never got around to covering last year, and they've got a lot of it in here.
Sounds great. Well, we've fortunately, I think, got around to covering all of the articles this week, so that was fantastic. I want to thank all of our listeners for once again joining us, and as always, thank you, John, for joining me. We'll see you in 2 weeks on Application Security Weekly.